one of the reasons I think that people don't speak up is that once you've entered into a corporatist atmosphere, corporatism loves calm. It's all about professionals who talk quietly among each other, you know, exchanging information when absolutely necessary, but no waves in public. And you're admired for helping to keep things calm. It's considered to be professional. That's why it resembles that Victorian niceness, public niceness in a way. So, you know, Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize, an economist, very interesting economist, said a few years ago, the introduction of econometrics to the study of economics has brought great rigor, but also, alas, mortis. You are there, aren't you? I mean, and I think that that's a nice summary for many, many areas where the silos have prevented people from thinking that it's possible to look in a horizontal and an integrated manner in order to do the work, but also take the public stands and the public risks, to learn how to take an intellectual risk. Now, what I'm going to do for the rest of the speech is to give you 5 examples of this sort of thing and how it can be dealt with. And the first of them, I thought I'd just do a little exercise in chaos theory, which is to say that, you know, a few years ago I wrote a book called Acquiescing Globalism, and, you know, it was treated very well, and it sold a lot of copies and all the rest of it. But essentially, I have the sense, both here and in the other countries where I've talked about it, that people haven't been able to get beyond the idea, well, you're either for globalization, you're against globalization, but they haven't actually, you know, nobody in the economics department has been able to stand back and say, well, what does this actually mean? What's the shape of what's happening? Where are we actually going? And I feel, when I look at newspapers and radio and go to meetings and things, that we see events, we hear about events, but we don't seem to have trained ourselves. And it's back to this silo business. We're either entertained by a fait divers, or we're upset by something for about 12 minutes, and then we move to the next page, and maybe it's only a minute. We seem to see things as events, or something's happened, but we seem to have lost to a great extent that ability to look at something and say, well, that's what that means. Look at that, that's happening, that means something. That's taking us somewhere. So all I've done is, I just went through my files before coming here and pulled out about, I don't know, 20 or so things in date order. So it's pure, you know, chaos theory. It's not in intellectual order, it's in date order. And therefore there's no relationship theoretically between the things that I found are from newspapers or from speeches and so on. And what they are is they're absolutely fascinating indications of the fact that we have moved out of the globalist era towards some sort of other era without having any discussion about what that era would be or what it could become. I mean, it's actually astonishing that a civilization as sophisticated as Western civilization could move so far from the language and theories that were believed to be inevitable and true towards something else without there being actually a discussion about where we were going and the way in which it would happen. And that's just, you know, 27 August. 2006, Financial Times. Bernanke, the head of the federal chair in the United States, got up and called on global policymakers to do more to ensure the benefits of globalization are spread within their countries. He said it was essential to build a consensus for welfare-enhancing change. Notice the word, that's really astonishing. Use the word. To avoid a resurgence of protectionism. Quote, geopolitical concerns, including international tensions and risks of terrorism, already constrain the pace of worldwide economic integration and may do so even more in the future. The current episode of globalization has many similarities with past phases of international integration. So there, the most powerful financial officer in the world said, the marketplace no longer dominates. We're going to need a return to government policy to spread money around, welfare policy and so on. Government policy. Governments are extremely central to things, more powerful than markets. Markets are not capable of doing it. And globalization is not inevitable. As he said, we've lost it before in the past and we could lose it again. It's an astonishing statement. It just sort of went by. So, oh, what are we having for lunch? You know. This is more important than anything that was said in the 1970s and 80s by any of the pro-globalists. That was a declaration of the fact that globalization is over. November 25th, 2006, lead editorial, Financial Times. Ignore a volatile world at your peril. Markets have never been good at spotting and pricing political risks. There was little volatility in British government bonds, for example, in the run-up to the First World War. At some point, therefore, expectations of low volatility will turn out to be wrong. This could not have been written 15 years earlier. The Financial Times would never have admitted that it was possible that the market could be so stupid as to make such a mistake that everything would fall apart and governments would have to come back in to shape events. 27th of February 2007, I was at a meeting in London and I heard Lord Giddens, who was the globalist theorist putting words into the mouth of Tony Blair, giving the most astonishing speech. He was the person who really came up with a lot of the phrases about the inevitability of globalization and marketplace and so on. And suddenly he stood up and he was saying that it's not about economics at all. It's really a communications revolution that started in the early 70s. And his assumption was that nobody would stand. He went straight out of the room afterwards, which is a classic. So he didn't hear what I said, which was to say that he seems to have forgotten everything that he said for 25 years. And he's hoping that we had as well. Because, of course, he was admitting that he was wrong. But he wasn't admitting he was wrong openly. He was just hoping we'd go on to the next subject without noticing it. And by doing that, of course, there wouldn't be a discussion about the direction the society was taking. March 14th, 2007, Abbott, one of the big pharmaceuticals, pulls HIV drug from Thailand in a protest against the Thais refusing certain things because they were unhappy about the prices. And the pharmaceutical group is to withhold a new HIV treatment from Thailand in retaliation for Bangkok's decision to override patents. It's a confrontation between Thailand and Western drug companies over appropriate drug pricing. Abbott, Merck, and others fear that other middle-income countries will follow Thailand's example. And of course they say the terrible implications for innovation. Well, we all know, or we should know, because it's been publicly put out on a regular basis by people including the FT, that the drug companies spend, I believe, double the amount on public relations that they do on research and development. So I'm not worried about their research and development budgets. But the point is about this is that what's happening here is that we have an admission from the drug companies that intellectual property is on the point of exploding. And if it explodes, it'll have an enormous impact on the international trade system. June 10th, 2007. The New Zealand national regulator blocked the takeover of the major what do they call it? Retail sector company, Warehouse, by its largest competitors. New Zealand, the former poster child of globalization since '99, has been going in a different direction, didn't collapse. And here we are in 2007, and they're continuing to say, no, we want competition. We don't want what you call globalization, which actually seems to be the removal of competition through the creation of oligopolies. And doing all of this has had no negative effect on their economy. June 2007, the Globe and Mail. The head of the OECD quotes, "Millions are benefiting from globalization, but at the same time there's a feeling something's wrong with the process," said the Secretary General. A growing number of economists are expressing concern about the number of losers from globalization. The conventional wisdom was that all boats would be lifted by the rising tide. That was overly optimistic. But there's no discussion. There's no idea that, actually you said absolutely that this was inevitable and true and that we had to go in this direction. But if we're not going that direction, we better have a pretty basic discussion about the direction we're to go in. No, let's not have a discussion about it. Let's just leak out a few little things and suggest that a few little things be done and keep the waters calm. A little later, June 2007, in the FT, globalization needs more PR to be sold to the losers. What can one say about lines like that, right? I mean, this is a lack. Where was the scholar? And this is a very fine newspaper. How could they write that without being embarrassed? And then at the end they say, globalization is inevitable. It brings greater prosperity to many, but if it proceeds in an atmosphere of resentment, only an atmosphere, those people are unemployed, it's an atmosphere, its undoubted overall benefits will be at risk. Well, if its overall benefits can be at risk, that means it's not inevitable. That's political science 101, right? I mean, you said it was inevitable, and now you're saying it's risky, it's benefits or risk. Well, either it's inevitable or it isn't. Make up your mind. That's one paragraph. And that's the kind of thing which is coming throughout the world in a discussion, which isn't a discussion about the direction we're taking. Have I knocked something off? No. 8th of August 2007, the U.S. Secretary of Trade says protectionist trend is worrisome. It threatens American jobs. He's admitting that protectionism could return. There is, in fact, as you know, no candidate running for the presidency of the United States and no person running for the Senate or the House of Representatives of any consequence who's in favor of globalization. They're all, at various degrees, against it. And yet, in Canada, is there a discussion, since we are so dependent on the American market, is there an interesting discussion about how we're going to handle that situation when there's a president who actually doesn't believe in the deals that we've done? I mean, I don't think they'll be ripped up, but are we having a national discussion about what direction are we going to go in? Globalization isn't working out. Canada, we got to be smart here. We got to look after ourselves. We got to figure out where we're going. We're not having a debate about it. Instead of that, we're just sort of hoping desperately that nothing will happen. August 2007, Russia and China flex military muscle. First ever major military exercises of the two countries in decades and decades. Russia, oil plus arms. China, manufacturing plus arms. Clearly not the idea that the marketplace is going to dominate. Paul Kennedy, the wonderful writer and thinker, a little later in the same month, talking about the resumption of strategic bomber flights by the Russians in the old Cold War manner. Western oil companies are discovering that a contract is not necessarily viewed by the Moscow government as a sacred legal obligation. It's insisting upon altered conditions to ensure that the Kremlin and its agencies are in control. Moscow seems to be advancing its international claims with the same speed that it denounces arms controls accords. It's hard to keep up. And it's all about the return of nationalism, something that was supposed to slip away with the growth of globalization. September 2007, Sarkozy and Merkel, meeting together, condemned le capitalisme sauvage. Le capitalisme a-t-il fait le capitalisme doit être là pour les entrepreneurs, pas pour les spéculateurs. Pas question de laisser quelques dizaines de spéculateurs mettre par terre tout un système international. And then Merkel said that they needed to elaborate a code of behavior in order to protect ourselves against the marketplace. Astonishing. You know, Germany is the largest exporter in the world. This is not, this is not a protester. This is the head of the most powerful exporter in the world. And then suddenly in September, late September of 2007, Mr. Harper, out of nowhere, attacks the United States for its focus on nationalism, saying it hurts our economic ties, that he was deeply concerned that the political discourse in the U.S. had been infected by populism, protectionism, and nationalism in an unhealthy sense. Well, he's quite right to be worried about that. But that's not thinking about it. That's a sort of, at least he said it. I mean, whatever your views are, at least he said it. But we haven't had since then any kind of, where are the professors? Where are the economists? Where are the political scientists saying, well, if our Prime Minister is saying that and the United States is saying that, we better have a massive national intellectual discussion about the direction this country is going to go in. Because we have not structured our economy for this kind of change of direction. We could be in deep, deep trouble very quickly if we don't have a proper discussion. October 2007, Microsoft finally gives in to the EU saying that they were an oligopoly and that it was unacceptable and that they weren't going to be allowed to function unless they followed the rules of government, not of the marketplace. And in fact, they had to sell a number of their secret codes to rivals so that they could get into business against them. Later, in November 2007, just an interesting thing, Britain, which was intellectually the leading country in the globalist movement, which was, of course, supposed to bring back free individual in free markets. Finally, a country which had refused resolutely to have identity cards as being a sign that they were not free individuals. As a direct result, apparently, of globalization, announced about 5 years ago that it was going to have identity cards because it was inevitable in a globalist world. And then, in November of 2007, they lost the secured information for 25 million British citizens, and nobody knows where it went, indicating that actually the technology which they say has made it inevitable seems not to be such a powerful beast after all. It just seems to be rather Kafkaesque and requires human beings to make sure that something doesn't go wrong. December 3rd, 2007. After a disastrous corn harvest in 2005, almost 5 million people in Malawi, of its 13 million people, needed emergency food aid. Over the past 20 years, the World Bank and some of the richest countries have kept on insisting to Malawi they won't get help unless they adopt free market globalist policies for their agriculture. Finally, the president decided that he would ignore them completely, and instead he would adopt American national policies, which is to say he would subsidize fertilizer. So he massively subsidized fertilizer, and as a result of this nationalist, anti-globalist act, Malawi is now exporting corn to other parts of Africa. I mean, this is reality that we don't really talk about. In late 2007, the financial crisis that we're in began to erupt, and suddenly governments discovered that they'd been so lazy because it was inevitable in the marketplace that they no longer understood the marketplace at all, certainly not the financial marketplace. And as a result of that, they had to actually call Ben Bernanke in to explain to him how the marketplace worked, which is to say it didn't. But they had to explain to him how it wasn't working, what the theory was. And once they had it explained to them, they did, the British and the Americans, the two leaders of the globalist movement, did what any sensible national anti-globalist government would do. They poured billions and billions of dollars into the private sector in order to prevent banks from going bankrupt. In other words, they did what people did in the late 19th century and in the 1920s and 30s. There's nothing modern about this. This is very, very old-fashioned economics. And then the last example was from the Vancouver Sun today, and it was about seeds. I don't know if you all saw it. And it was about the genetically modified seeds. I'm not making a comment on that, but about the fact that there are now 12 million farmers around the world who plant those seeds, having signed contracts promising that they will not save seeds in order to replant them, which of course is profoundly anti-capitalist, anti-competition, anti-marketplace, and of course anti the traditions of farming. So what's interesting about it is that after 30 years you have a situation where either it's being given up, or what isn't being given up is the precise opposite of what we were told would happen. We were told there'd be more competition, more individualism, more freedom, more marketplace. And instead of that, what you see succeeding is, in fact, oligopolies, less competition, mercantilism, corporatism, anti-capitalist behavior from the people speaking in favor of capitalism. That requires a debate. Where are the scholars? It's not about whether you're for or against it. It's about where are we going to go. Every time a social scientist goes to an international meeting where British or American ideas dominate and comes back, it becomes less and less likely that anybody's going to sit down and say, are we teaching our philosophy right? Are we teaching our political science right? Because we're so busy trying to pretend that we have a meritocratic system like Harvard. That's called mediocre colonialism.